It's time now to prepare your sleeve. You're going to sew your fashion fabric sleeves together. I encourage you to lay out your right sleeve and your left sleeve at the same time. If your fabric is at all like mine, it's really hard for me to tell which is the right side and the wrong side. And if I lay out both of my sleeves next to each other, that will ensure that I end up with a right sleeve and a left sleeve instead of two rights or two lefts, something I have done before. At this point, in my example, my sleeve has 5/8 inch seam allowances. If you have a seam allowance that is bigger than 5/8, make sure you know where your stitching line is. You can still stitch the sleeve with the bigger seam allowance, but you are going to want to trim them down to 5/8 of an inch. There's really no need for a larger, deeper seam allowance in your sleeve once you know the sleeve fits. So, I differ a little bit from the instructions in the pattern guide sheet because I want you to first sew the out seam. So you can see here is my upper sleeve, here's my under sleeve, see the sleeve cap comes up, and we're going to sew the seam that is the highest one. That is the out seam. That's the one that curves with your elbow. And the reason we're going to sew that first is that if you have a sleeve and you've chosen not to put a vent in the sleeve, you still may want to think about putting decorative buttonholes down at the bottom. Let me show you on the pattern. So these are your buttonhole markings, and even if you've chosen to not do a vent, you may choose to put decorative buttonholes there to sew your buttons on. You don't have to. It's perfectly fine just to sew buttons on when we're done. But if you want to do these buttonholes, now is the best time to do it, because if we sew this outer seam, we can then press it open, lay things flat, and I'm going to show you how to mark the buttonholes. So as you're sewing up the outseam, one of the things to remember is we have interfacing at the bottom of our sleeve, and you've also thread marked your sleeve hem. And you want to make sure that you put a pin through right here to make sure that you have lined up your hem allowance, your hem markings. So I'm going to go over, sew this at 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to press it. Because this seam is curved, I know it's hard to see because of my camera, but it's curved to accommodate our elbow. I'm going to press this seam open using a pressing ham so that I can keep that nice curve in my fabric. So once I stitch this and press it, I'll be right back to show you about marking buttonholes. All right, I've sewn my back seam, the one that goes over the elbow, and I did press it on a pressing ham to keep the nice curve in it. So I want to show you next, if you want to put buttonholes in your sleeve that doesn't have a vent, you can. The pattern guide has you do this when the sleeve is completely done and with the lining, which I find very odd. So I'm going to show you how to do it while your sleeve is laying flat. So here is my sleeve. You can lay my pattern out, line up my cut edges, right? Now, I'm the medium, so I want to mark the medium and medium buttonholes. So I'm just going to put a couple pins in my pattern up a little higher so it doesn't shift and get out of the way. I find the easiest way to do this is if I fold up my pattern, I can see where my bottom buttonhole is, and since I'm the medium one, I'm the one right here in the center, and I'm using chalk, and I can chalk the line, and then I chalk the vertical lines. So I've already done that for 3 of them. And I'll go back and measure and make sure that they're as they need to be. And my 4th one, I just keep rolling my pattern up till I can see where my line is. For my buttonhole, I'm going to mark my horizontal line. And I'm going to mark the vertical lines. So now that I have those, this one's a little strange. My fabric is a little difficult to mark on because I do have some stretch in it, but I want to make sure that this edge of my buttonhole is the same distance from my seam, which looks to be about 1/4 of an inch. So that's good. Work this vertical line a little better. Mark my horizontal lines, and I want to make sure that all of my horizontal lines are actually parallel to one another. And they seem to be pretty parallel. They should be the same distance from one another. So I can go so now I have my buttonholes marked. One of the things that I want to check out is that I would like to have something stabilizing underneath. So just so that I know where those are, I could thread mark them, but I don't want to add thread here and get it in the way of my buttonhole stitching. So I'm putting pins on my sleeve where my buttonholes are going to be. So I can turn it over, and now I see here's the area that I need to reinforce. And it's okay that it's over the seam, quite frankly. I could actually push the seam back, which would make sense. So if I were to fold my seam allowance back out of the way, I can put some stabilizer right here, and I'll do some fusible stabilizer in this area so that I can make my buttonholes, not have them be over my seam allowance, and be nice and flat, and then I can press my seam allowance out again, press it open again. I'm not going to cut open these buttonholes. They are purely decorative. They're only there to be decorative. So I'm going to reinforce this area and come back and show you. All right, I have pressed my seam allowance over to one side, as you can see, both of them over, and I've applied a piece of stabilizer. So this is a little bit heavier weight interfacing, and I've put it in the space behind my buttonholes. I stopped it at the seam. It's about 1 inch taller, 1 inch below, and about, oh, I would say, a 1/2 inch, right, past. So I've stabilized this area, which I feel pretty good about. So now I can go make my buttonholes, keeping my seam allowance out of the way. And now I can go make my buttonholes while my fabric is still flat. All right, I've made my buttonholes. I will have to admit to you, I did not do samples on this fabric before I put them in. So consequently, I've got a little squidginess going on. I think the first two lined up quite nicely. Then the second two kind of got a little out of kilter. So you will want to mark your buttonholes better than I did on your sleeve. The other thing that I noticed, if I flip it over, I actually, even though I pressed my seam allowance out of the way, I caught it in the first two buttonholes. Now, should I have ripped them out and redone them? Of course I should have, but my fabric's lightweight enough, and for our demonstration purposes, I was moving forward, so I did clip around my fabric. So here are my buttonholes from the back side. You can see they're not, these two are lined up with each other, these two are lined up with each other. I should have done a better job lining them up. Then I press my seam allowance open again, and I'm done. So now, to finish up my sleeve for our purposes right now, what I'm going to do is put the front seam together, stitch it at 5/8, press it open on a sleeve board, and then my sleeves will be ready. I'll set them to the side with my sleeve linings, and they are ready for when we're ready to put the sleeves in, and that's all I need you to do.